Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Code and Pixel podcast. My name is Adekunle and I'm joined by my wonderful host Kelly. Kelly, who are we talking to today?
Hey, Adekunle. We are joined today by Abid Al-Ghazali, who is actually an engineer on my team at Intuit. Abid, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Kelly and Abdalkadir. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Glad you could join us. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your role on the consumer group design system team?
Sure. I am a software engineer. I specialize in front end, primarily web. I have started to dabble with some native technologies as well, primarily iOS, and that's been a fun journey. The consumer group design system was kind of born out of TurboTax initially when I went into its products, and it just needed a way to essentially create a really high quality experience for our developers. So initially just started out as a component library and then really grew rapidly into a full on design system that's currently being consumed by easily over 100 projects at this point and certainly not limited to TurboTax anymore.
Awesome. So, the focus of this episode is about being self taught. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you ended up in this field?
Sure. How much time do we have? Because it's a long journey. Yeah. So funny enough, I do have a degree. It's in biochemistry. Once upon a time, I was pre med and was going down the whole med school route. I certainly didn't really know what I wanted to do in high school. Definitely wasn't thinking about my career. I was more concerned with skateboarding and what band my crush was listening to at that time. So I, like a lot of other people, I think, I ended up Googling what's the highest paying job. And it was anesthesiologist at the time. So I was like, all right, cool. I want to be a doctor because exactly. But in reality, I just wasn't really thinking about my career at the time. That journey was quite rough. I didn't really enjoy what I was doing in the process, but I kind of felt stuck and guilty for jumping ship. I kept telling myself, oh, this is just part of the journey. You're just reaching like the sea of despair. And at some point that you'll be happy and really enjoy what you're doing. Well, that was not true. I essentially got to a point where I graduated, had my degree, studied for the MCAT exams, entrance exams for med school, and was literally driving to my MCAT exam. And that's when I really had the thought, wow, I really hate this. Do I really want to commit to this? And the answer was no. So existential crisis ensues. I start to try to think of like what I want to do instead. Tried many random things, ballet for a while. I was quite a creative person. I really enjoyed creating digital art and just playing around with the whole Adobe suite at the time and started to dabble a little bit with UX design, product design, honestly, like whatever project that I could get my hands on at the time. And that was also self-taught. Some random furniture store took a chance on me. They had a e-commerce platform where they sold a lot of their wholesale furniture, and they essentially hired me initially to help design their really new theme. And I had a friend at the time that was also self-taught, and he had ended up at a startup, and he was telling me, oh, like you should like really look into front end web development. It's great. And I think you would like it. And so I started to go online, like I think it was like codeacademy.com or something, and took the HTML and CSS course. And then I took the JavaScript course. HTML, CSS, straightforward. Like it really made me confident being able to, put pictures on a website and text and using Flexbox, like just made me really empowered. I was like, yeah, like I can do this. And so after that, I got into the JavaScript course, and that's when things really like hit a bit of a wall. And I was like, wow, like this is hard. I don't know if I could do this. So yeah, JavaScript was very discouraging. And I actually decided at the time that I was not going to get into web development and stick to design. I just enjoyed being creative for myself in that way. And so it, I stuck with it for about 2 years until eventually I was like, I like really should try to get over that hurdle of JavaScript. And so I actually enrolled in like an intro CS course at like my local community college, and they they had an intro Java series, which was actually great because it gave you like a bit of a structure to follow and really start to like learn data structures and algorithms and things that like are a good basis for software. And so I decided to really just double down on online learning. I looked for any resource that I can get my hands on. CS50 was great. A lot of YouTube videos from random YouTubers, and just with a little bit of my Java knowledge at the time, it really helped me better understand JavaScript. And it's very generic, non-tied nature, which was quite confusing initially, but eventually I was starting to get it. And that's when TypeScript was starting to become popular. So that's when I started to really enjoy getting into software. I think the original question was centered around getting into design systems, right?
Um, yeah, just getting into the field in general, but I am curious. So your degree was in biochemistry?
Yes. Yep.
Do you use any of those skills today, or
Well,
has that?
let's see. I am certainly not pipetting anything or doing anything related to, microorganisms or DNA or RNA. So no, it's the simple answer.
I didn't know if you had like a lab set up somewhere.
Yeah, no, a lot of lab based stuff for sure. I actually also did a little bit of like lab research out of college because I was like, oh, I have a degree, I might as well utilize it, but it's not for me.
Cool. So it sounds like you have a lot of experience in lots of different things. I'm curious, what was it like to go from product design development to more of a centralized team, something like design systems where you're producing work that these product teams are consuming?
Very different and a lot of imposter syndrome for sure. My first web dev job was just contract and WordPress. And then I got a job at a startup at some point, and they had a component library, and that was great, but quite different than a full on design system with a centralized team. It was really just like everyone kind of like random. There's like teams everywhere that like, would contribute to this library, but there was no dedicated team. So come to Intuit and joining a centralized team that was like purely focused on the design system was quite a new experience for me, being in an environment where we're constantly collaborating with designers from inception of the component or the feature or whatever it is to deployment. It's more structured than what I was used to, but also surprisingly a lot of freedom and autonomy within that process, which really made it an exciting thing to be a part of.
Well, since we're on the same team, I can also relate to that. So, speaking of solving problems for other teams, can you talk about a current challenge that you're trying to solve for?
A great question. So I talked about how our design system was essentially built to kind of supplement a lot of the TurboTax experiences and developers' experiences. Well, now that we have a lot more products and teams under our umbrella, it's the challenge has been really scaling it to provide that quality experience for everyone. One big thing is we're having to deal with a lot of new use cases and edge cases that we've never really thought about. We've had to really scale our test suite in order to accommodate all these use cases. Even things as simple as people really consuming our components has been a challenge too. When you have so many people consuming these components, that tends to put a little bit of pressure on the registry itself. So we get people like, hey, I can't even install this component. Also seeing how our design team from like the design side is also scaling to accommodate all these new requests and kind of adapt as we grow. It's certainly like quite the learning curve, but I think everyone's really taken that challenge on and has been doing an excellent job.
One thing I want to get into like is more about your career, like, and it's more of like a hot take. But in your opinion, what is easier, break into design or engineering?
Oh, that's a good one. I think engineering was easier, certainly because the resources online were more readily available. I felt like when I was trying to get into design, I might have also been my process too that affected this, but I certainly was finding it a little bit more difficult trying to like do specific things. And so I'd have to heavily rely on like YouTube videos to do them versus having something a little bit more like a little bit more structured online, something similar to the CS50 program or a lot of these other platforms like Code Academy. I think that have been helpful. Also, with engineering, you have all these kind of like platforms like LeetCode and HackerRank that really help you develop that problem solving aspect or paradigm of engineering versus with design. I certainly felt like I lacked that like fundamental understanding of a lot of different concepts. So it was really just like I get an idea, and so I dabble with all these tools, whether it's like the Adobe Suite or at the time it was like Sketch app was like the cool thing to use. That just dabbling with them and finding enough little resources online to be able to stitch something together to make it work. So certainly not high quality designing.
Yeah, I always tell people that even though I study art and design in school, it's still like the hardest thing because sometimes you could follow the rules and also you could break the rules and it's both fine, which is like always interesting. And then just to get back into when you were kind of like looking for jobs and applying for roles, what was it the feeling of trying to apply for designers or engineer roles with an unrelated major?
Yeah, a lot of imposter syndrome, like I mentioned. I knew people had have done it and that companies have become increasingly tolerant of people with, non-traditional backgrounds. But being a part of that process was certainly tough, especially there's that initial period when you're trying to land your first role where you're not even hearing back from anyone. You're applying to like hundreds of companies and no one's even like looking at you. So you do get quite discouraged and, you know, start to like rethink like whether this is worth it or not. What was really surprising to me was that when I started to eventually get interviews, a lot of companies didn't really even ask me about my degree. I used a lot of those interviews as like a learning opportunity to pick up the lingo, which is something they also didn't have, being able to talk in like designy terms or engineering terms and almost like faking it till I make it kind of thing, just like trying to convince people that like, you know, I wasn't lying to people, but I was trying to convince people that like, hey, I know this stuff. And that's where I really started to think, oh, maybe I should build a portfolio, a way for people to really be able to kind of see what I can do.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that kind of brings us to like the next question around like portfolio. Can you talk about like your approach for building your portfolio?
Sure. I honestly did not have a portfolio. It was a lot of local companies taking chances on me. Uh, one of the jobs that I got, like the job that I got at print shop, doing like like all the designing for them, which a lot of it was like kind of more product design. Uh, I straight up walked in there. I got introduced through a mutual acquaintance and walked in there and talked to the owner of the shop, and we shook hands, and that was it. So that was very different versus when I started to apply to startup companies and even like bigger companies. At that point, I had to kind of transition towards full on engineering, and not having much experience made it very difficult to kind of communicate with people in the interviews. So I built this portfolio. I was, I didn't really have much money at the time. So I was thinking, how can I do this? How can I set up a whole portfolio, host it for free and like all these things. So I started to started to like look for resources like that. And there's like a ton of resources like that. There's GitHub pages, which is where I to this day have my portfolio hosted on elghazali.com if anyone's curious. And I was like, okay, cool. What should I put on my portfolio to make it look like I know front end engineering and progressive web apps and all these things? And so I kind of did a little bit of a mixture of small projects that I worked on for companies, some of these like smaller local companies, and also personal projects. I branded these personal projects as like full on businesses, actually, which really did help me in my interview process. One of them, one of these projects that I like to talk about is called Hoop Trade. And I love basketball. I love fantasy basketball as well. I'm in two leagues with a lot of my friends. And I essentially had this idea, oh, like what if I created this app that made it a lot easier to kind of facilitate trades in fantasy? And so built this app, super simple, just really a table with like fancy filtering and stuff. And I used Material UI or something to like theme it. So it was like a pretty small project, but it was a great learning experience for me because that's when I really started to get into some of the UI frameworks. I think I built that one with Vue.js, which was my first love for sure. I love Vue.js, and it gets a lot of questions in my interviews like, oh, what's this Hoop Trade? And I even had it on my resume. I literally put Hoop Trade, founder of Hoop Trade on my resume. And people are like, oh, what's this Hoop Trade you're talking about? And I tell them, this is actually this project that I like came up with. And actually a lot of my friends use it now. And it's been quite the successful tool to use for fantasy trades. And that's really how I built my portfolio. I just made it look polished. I made it look also simple. I figured out like, okay, I just need like to get to the point, some like short description about who I am, my projects, and then my skill set at the bottom. I used some horrendous grid generator, like CSS grid generators to come up with this. I don't even know what they call it. They're like these columns that show like how proficient I am with my skill set. But hey, it worked, and people have given me compliments on my portfolio.
Yeah, I love that. I also did that too, where it was like different levels. And then I think one time I looked at it and I was like, this doesn't really make sense. Like, am I saying that I'm more proficient in like I'm 10% more proficient in JavaScript than like React? So that's when I kind of like removed it with like all this stuff we've been doing between design, engineering. Do you have a particular like learning style that you feel like, well, it's very helpful for you to kind of uh, implement your designs and also like coding, but also in a way where you're learning while you're doing?
My particular style is banging my head against the wall until I figure it out. I don't really have any fancy style or anything like that. I just learn by doing and failing until I get it right. And that is maybe not the most efficient style, but it works for me personally. And that's how I tell myself how to code. That's how I really dive deeper into the whole nature of like progressive web apps and, web engineering in general. And I have a lot of projects on my personal GitHub that are absolute garbage, honestly. But I throw them all up in there to really kind of showcase my journey and how that's progressed and how I've learned. As much as my old self would probably hate this, learning how to read documentation has really helped me progress in my career. That's something that I kind of resisted for a while because it's difficult to, read through some of those docs and some of those white papers and all those types of things when you're kind of like first getting into the field. And then I would just end up trying to like look something up on YouTube. Like I'm just going to watch a video for this instead. That worked well for a little bit, but then eventually, like once you really want to jump to the next level, you really have to like kind of cultivate a bit, it's like almost like a skill. Also, as we all know, Googling things, that's a great skill. But that's something that I also learned was very important in being self-taught, since you have to, you know, figure out your own path. You have to find all these resources that are there, but you have to, get better at like finding them. And so uh, that certainly helped me progress as well.
Yeah, that's kind of like, my process too, where it's like, I don't know how to do it, but I'm gonna figure it out, and I end up, like, feeling like most of the time, but then when I figure it out, I'm like, "Ah, I actually got something done," which it feels so good. You mentioned it before about learning new things and whatnot. Can you talk about when you have, like, a gap of knowledge, being, like, a self-taught designer and developer, and how do you address it?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I am to this day really focusing on growing in is essentially bigger picture things. I think like when it comes to like system architecture and really like taking a step back from just building, you know, set like components or thinking about like specific aspects of like a design system. So really like thinking about the design system as a whole and how it can be utilized by multiple products across multiple teams and really being able to kind of think that those high level details that will help you, like, for example, help us currently scale to cater to like a bigger user base. So those are things that I'm sure would have helped to have a little bit more traditional education. And I certainly am pretty heavily front end focused. I do have a little bit of like data structure and algorithm background just from really enjoying being on some of those platforms and like doing some of the competitions and stuff. But yeah, like breadth of knowledge is something that I probably lack a little bit compared to people that did go the traditional route. So I'm sure as my career progresses, I can pick those things up. Uh, but yeah, something that I currently having to put a lot more effort into to really accommodate.
Wait, so you're not doing leak code exercises on Friday night?
Once upon a time, I was, yes, and they were fun. I mean, it definitely really helped me grow and really helped me in interviews because in interviews, they were asking a lot of those things. I interviewed with like several big tech companies and they all had, those generic data structure and algorithm
Mhm.
related problems. I'm starting to see a trend of companies starting to have more, specialized interviews. Actually, when I interviewed with Intuit, they had like, the initial technical generic question, but the progressing forward is like became very front end focused, which I really enjoyed. And actually I was a lot more successful at. So
Cool. So, in closing for this episode, I have one last question. Let's say someone is trying to be a design systems engineer or designer. What is one piece of advice you would give them?
uh don't, I was joking. Piece of advice, being able to communicate and develop the confidence to communicate because certainly with our design system team, it's a very collaborative process. There's a lot of times where you might feel like you might have a stupid question, but not sound cliche, but there really are no stupid questions. We welcome any sort of questions and it certainly helps us feel more confident in you as a team member and being able to ask them and better understand what's going on, really being learning how to communicate with designers better or vice versa, designers learning how to communicate with engineers. You're going to have to pick up some of the lingo from the other side, whether you're engineer or design, but that's okay. It's not any different than what your discipline already does. So better understanding uh, each other's processes in the design system. We actually Kelly helped automate our asset generation for a lot of our like visual assets in our design system and uh, taught our designers how to partake in part of this process. And so they were super open to it. And now we're a lot more efficient. So yeah, just being open to get out of your comfort zone a little bit and be more collaborative just so we can have a healthy and efficient design system.
I did not tell Ovid to say that, by the way. That was not
Not scripted.
not scripted. Awesome. So, where can folks find you on the internet?
Sure. So I would say if you have any questions regarding, being self-taught or pursuing whether maybe like I'm more kind of an engineer now, so I can probably answer better when it comes to engineering questions than design, but feel free to reach out to me through my portfolio, elghazali.com. And I have my email on there, I'm pretty sure, and also my GitHub portfolio. So yeah, just reach out if you have any questions. And yeah, I'm always more than happy to answer people's questions. I'm usually on some random YouTube videos answering comments and stuff.
Cool, cool. And do you have any plugs or shout outs you want to give?
Sure. I'll plug myself. I'm currently making content around cooking. So if you're on Instagram or TikTok or any of those medias, follow me at Diet Zamzam or Diet Zamzam, not Diet Zamzam. Diet Zamzam. You'll be thoroughly entertained, I'll say.
Well, thank you so much, Abid, for joining us on this episode of Code and Pixels. And if you want to see or listen to more episodes, please check out our website, codeandpixels.fm. We are also on LinkedIn and we're also on Spotify, and we will eventually be in other places. And that's all for now. Bye.